The great temple of Anubis loomed in the darkness, its towering statues casting long shadows across the stone floor. The scent of burning incense choked the air, mingling with the faint, lingering stench of death. Meritneith moved like a phantom through the temple halls, her golden robes trailing behind her, the hem stained with dirt and tears. She had not come as a queen tonight. She had come as a desperate woman. Her heart pounded as she reached the altar, her knees hitting the cold stone floor. Above her, the massive black jackal statue of Anubis towered in silence, its carved eyes gleaming under the dim torchlight. The god of death, the keeper of souls. Fear clawed at her chest, but she forced herself to speak, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Great Anubis, hear my plea." Silence stretched around her, thick and suffocating. She clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. "I offer myself, my soul, anything. Just save him. Save Kemet." Her voice cracked, a single tear slipping down her cheek. No mortal should dare seek the god of death. The price is too high, the priests had warned her, but she had no choice. Her kingdom was falling, her husband lay dying. If the gods would not listen, then she would turn to the one who ruled over the souls they abandoned. Beyond the temple walls, the once mighty kingdom of Kemet crumbled. The Nile, the lifeblood of the land, had begun to recede, its once mighty currents reduced to a sluggish trickle. Famine gripped the villages, children crying from hunger as their mothers prayed to silent gods. Crops withered under the merciless sun. The palace, once a beacon of prosperity, now sat beneath a sky choked with the smoke of distant battles. Invaders threatened the borders, and the high priests whispered of omened shadows moving where there should be none. Unnatural deaths sweeping through the city, a curse upon the land. The gods had turned their backs. But worse than war, worse than famine, was the illness that had taken the pharaoh her Pharaoh. Mentuhotep, the great ruler of Kemet, the man she had loved and sworn to stand beside, lay wasting away in his bedchamber. His once powerful frame had withered to mere skin and bone, his breath shallow, his skin pallid and cold. No healer could explain it, and no prayer could cure it. His soul was slipping, being dragged into the abyss by unseen hands. Meritneith had exhausted every sacred rite, every offering, every desperate plea to the gods of the sun, the river, and the sky. None had answered. There was only one left to call. A chill slithered through the temple, curling around Meritneith like unseen fingers. The flames of the torches flickered, bending unnaturally toward the altar. Then, a voice, low, ancient, amused. "You dare call upon me?" The sound was not human. It seeped from the shadows like mist, thick and suffocating, wrapping around her like a living thing. Neferura's breath caught in her throat as the air in the temple shifted. The shadows deepened. A shape emerged from the darkness beyond the altar. Two golden eyes, gleaming like molten metal, cut through the gloom. A towering figure stepped forward, his form shifting between man and beast, draped in obsidian robes that swallowed the light. The jackal-headed god of death, Anubis. His gaze bore into her, his jackal snout curling into something resembling amusement. A queen who would trade her soul. How interesting. The temple trembled. The gods had ignored her, but death had answered. The land of Kemet was dying. Once the kingdom had thrived under the watchful eyes of the gods, its golden fields stretching far beyond the horizon, the Nile overflowing with life. Now, the river had shrunk to a feeble trickle. Its once strong currents slowed as if gasping for breath. The earth had cracked under the merciless sun, crops withering to dust before they could bear fruit. The people, once proud, once prosperous, now wandered the streets with hollow eyes and empty bellies. Mothers whispered prayers over their starving children, hoping for a sign that the gods still listened. But the gods had fallen silent. Beyond the palace walls, the villages teetered on the edge of ruin. Temples once filled with music and offerings now stood in eerie quiet, their priests afraid to speak the truth. Kemet was cursed. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some blamed the foreign invaders, who burned fields and pillaged sacred shrines. Others spoke of ominous unnatural deaths, strange shadows flickering in the streets at dusk, the feeling of unseen eyes watching from the dark. Fear had become a living thing, creeping through the kingdom like a beast waiting to devour them all. Inside the palace, the heart of Kemet's suffering lay upon a gilded bed, surrounded by silent attendants and anxious priests. Pharaoh Mentuhotep, the ruler of the land, the man once revered as a living god, had become a shadow of himself. His once powerful body had withered, his skin growing pale, almost translucent. His breath came in slow, ragged gasps, each one weaker than the last. The greatest healers in Kemet had tried everything: sacred herbs, spells carved into gold, prayers offered at every temple in the city, but nothing could touch the sickness that had stolen the pharaoh's strength. It was as if something unseen, something unnatural, was pulling his soul away, piece by piece. Meritneith sat beside him, gripping his hand, her fingers brushing against skin that had grown too cold. This was not a simple illness. She had seen men struck down by disease, but this was different. It felt as if death itself was standing in the room, waiting, watching. The priests muttered among themselves, their faces drawn in fear. She could see it in their eyes. They believed it too. This was no ordinary fate. This was a punishment, a curse. She looked at her husband's face, at the man she had loved for so many years. He was slipping through her fingers like sand, and she was powerless to stop it. She had begged the gods for mercy, had given offerings, had knelt before every altar in Kemet, but there had been no answer. There was only silence. Meritneith had always been a woman of faith, a queen who honored the gods, who upheld the sacred laws of the land. But faith had done nothing to save her people. Faith had left her husband dying. And so, when the whispers reached her ears, whispers of an ancient power, of a god who did not turn away from desperate souls, she listened. The old texts spoke of him, hidden away in forbidden scrolls deep within the royal archives. Anubis, the god of the dead, the keeper of lost souls, the one who walked the line between life and oblivion. His name was feared, spoken only in hushed tones by those who dared to believe in his power. The high priests warned against him. They said he only answered when the price was too high, that those who sought him never returned the same. She did not care. If the gods of light had abandoned her, then she would turn to the god of shadows. The temple was empty when she arrived, the night's darkness pressing against its stone walls like an unwelcome guest. The torches flickered as if they too feared what was to come. Meritneith moved with purpose, her footsteps echoing through the cavernous hall. She had read the ritual in an ancient scroll, words written in ink so old it had nearly faded to nothing. She knew what had to be done. With steady hands, she approached the altar. A bronze dagger lay before her, its blade inscribed with sacred markings. She picked it up, the weight of it heavy in her palm. Taking a deep breath, she pressed the sharp edge against her skin. A thin line of crimson bloomed across her palm, droplets of blood pooling and falling onto the cold stone below. She whispered the incantation, her voice steady, unwavering. The language was old, older than the temples, older than the gods who had forsaken her. The air around her thickened, the torches dimming as a deep, unnatural silence filled the temple. Then, the shadows began to move. A gust of cold air rushed through the chamber, snuffing out the flames one by one. The darkness was alive, shifting, twisting, crawling toward her. And then a voice, low, deep, ancient, amused. "You dare call upon me?" The temple trembled. The air itself seemed to crack under the weight of something unseen. Meritneith did not move, did not breathe. The gods had abandoned her, but death had answered. The temple walls seemed to close in around Meritneith as the voice slithered through the darkness, thick and suffocating like the air before a storm. The shadows twisted at the edges of her vision, shifting unnaturally, coiling into something more than mere absence of light. Then, from the blackness beyond the altar, two golden eyes emerged, gleaming like molten fire. A towering figure stepped forward, his form wavering between man and beast Anubis, the god of death. His jackal head tilted slightly as he observed her, the flickering torchlight reflecting off his sleek, obsidian black fur. His lips curled in something resembling amusement. A queen who would trade her soul, he mused, his voice smooth as silk, yet laced with something ancient and dangerous. How interesting. Meritneith forced herself to hold his gaze, though her heart pounded like war drums in her chest. She had spent her life fearing the gods, honoring their laws, never daring to stray from the path carved for her. Yet, standing before the god of death himself, she felt no fear only purpose. "My husband is dying," she said, her voice steady despite the cold that wrapped around her like unseen chains. "My kingdom is falling. I will not watch Kemet turn to dust while the gods do nothing." Anubis stepped closer, his presence drowning out everything else, the scent of incense, the distant hum of the city, even the flickering of the torches. He lifted one clawed hand, and the mark on her palm where she had spilled her own blood began to burn. "Power has a price, mortal," he murmured. "Are you willing to pay it?" Meritneith clenched her fists, ignoring the sting. "Yes." Anubis chuckled, a sound that sent a shiver through her spine. "Then it is done." The temple trembled as the shadows surged forward, wrapping around her, seeping into her skin. The world spun, and for a brief moment, Meritneith saw things she was not meant to see: seamless deserts of the afterlife, spirits wandering the dunes, the great scales where souls were weighed. Then, just as suddenly, the visions vanished. The shadows retreated, but their touch remained. The sigil of Anubis burned into her palm, glowing faintly before fading into her skin. "The power you seek is now yours," Anubis said, stepping back into the darkness. "But remember this, Queen of Kemet, when your time comes, I will collect what is mine." Then he was gone. Meritneith staggered, her breath coming in sharp gasps. The temple was silent once more, but she was no longer the same. The weight of her bargain pressed against her chest, but there was no time for regret. She had what she needed. She would save her kingdom, but she had also sealed her fate. The doors of the palace burst open as Meritneith stormed into the pharaoh's chamber. The priests barely had time to bow before she shoved past them, her eyes locked onto the frail figure lying on the bed. Mentuhotep's breath was shallow, his skin nearly translucent beneath the golden sheets. His body had grown so weak that even the weight of the linen seemed too much. The scent of herbs and decay clung to the air. She did not hesitate. Meritneith moved to his side, ignoring the whispers of the priests as she pressed her marked palm against his chest. The sigil of Anubis flared to life, searing with an unnatural heat. The chamber trembled. The torches flickered. The air thickened as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Then, the pharaoh's body jerked. A strangled gasp escaped his lips, his back arching as his eyes flew open, not weak, not clouded with sickness, but sharp, glowing with something unearthly. The priests staggered back in shock, murmuring prayers under their breath. Neferua's heart raced. She had done it. Mentuhotep's gaze locked onto hers, confusion flickering across his face. Then he sat up, stronger than before. His skin no longer held the sickly pallor of death, his breath steady and full. But as Meritneith reached for his hand, a chill passed through her. His fingers felt wrong, too cold, too strong. She dismissed the feeling. She had brought him back. That was all that mattered. The news spread through the kingdom. Like wildfire, Pharaoh Mentuhotep had risen from his deathbed, stronger than ever. The people rejoiced. Temples were filled with offerings, and the high priests praised Meritneith as a queen blessed by the gods. They did not question how she had done it. They only saw the miracle. With her husband restored, Meritneith wasted no time. She used her newfound power to strengthen Kemet's armies, forging alliances with the warlords who had once threatened their borders. Whispers spread of a queen who walked with the favor of the gods, whose enemies fell before her with unnatural ease. In battle, she seemed untouchable. Her enemies struck down before they could even lift their weapons. Her people called her a savior. But in the shadows, the whispers began to change. The priests noticed at first the way the temple statues seemed to flinch in her presence, the way the sacred fires dimmed when she entered. Some claimed they saw shadows moving around her, twisting unnaturally, curling toward her touch. Others swore her reflection flickered in the pools of holy water, her face momentarily becoming something else. And then there was the pharaoh. At first, Mentuhotep was, as he had always been, strong, commanding, the ruler his people adored. But slowly, he began to change. His voice grew colder, his temper sharper. He no longer smiled as he once did, no longer held Meritneith the same way. At night, she would wake to find him standing at the balcony, staring at the stars without blinking, unmoving for hours. Something was wrong. Meritneith could feel it, the weight of the magic, the cold touch of the shadows clinging to her soul. She had done what she set out to do. She had saved her husband. She had saved Kemet. But she had also invited something into her life that would never leave. The priest had begun to watch her carefully, whispering prayers behind her back. The temple doors, once open to her at all hours, now closed earlier, as if they feared her presence. The people still bowed before her, but there was something new in their eyes. Not just reverence, fear. And then one night, she awoke to the sound of whispers. Not from the palace halls, not from the priests, but from the darkness itself. The mark of Anubis burned on her palm, and in the silence of her chamber, a voice curled around her ears like smoke. "Your time is coming, Queen of Kemet." Meritneith closed her eyes, trying to push the voice away, but she already knew the truth. She had made a bargain with death, and death always collects its due. The first sign of the gods' anger came with the sky itself. A thick, unnatural darkness swallowed the sun, casting an eerie twilight over Kemet at midday. The high priests of Ra gathered in the great temple, their voices rising in desperate prayers, but no divine answer came. The sacred fires flickered and died on their own, leaving behind nothing but cold embers. The people whispered of omens of a queen who had defied the natural order, of a curse that had seeped into the very bones of the kingdom. Then came the pronouncement. Before the assembled court, the high priest of Ra stepped forward, his voice trembling with both fear and fury. "The gods have turned against us," he declared. His weathered hands trembled as he pointed directly at Neferura. "Our queen walks with death itself. She has brought darkness upon Kemet. She has defied the will of the gods." The court fell into stunned silence. Meritneith stood tall, her golden headdress gleaming even in the dim light, her expression unreadable. The nobles and warriors shifted uneasily, torn between loyalty and the fear curling in their hearts. She had saved them, but at what cost? Meritneith did not flinch. She met the priest's gaze with cold determination. "The gods abandoned us first," she said, her voice ringing through the halls. "When my husband lay dying, they did nothing. When Kemet fell into ruin, they remained silent. I did what had to be done." A murmur swept through the courtroom in agreement, others in horror. But the high priest's voice rose above them all. "You have bound yourself to the god of the dead. You have defiled the sacred balance. You are no longer our queen. You are an abomination." The words struck like a blade. Neferura's fingers curled into fists, but before she could respond, a deep, unearthly rumble shook the palace. A cold wind rushed through the halls, extinguishing the torches. The gods had heard the accusation, and they had answered. That night, Meritneith found her husband standing by the great palace balcony, unmoving. The golden jewelry adorning his arms caught the dim torchlight, but his face remained hidden in shadow. She stepped closer. "Mentuhotep?" Slowly, he turned. The moment she saw his face, she froze. His eyes, once warm, once full of life, were black. Not dark, not shadowed empty, void of anything human. His skin, once rich with the warmth of the sun, had taken on a pale grayish hue, stretched too tightly over his bones. He had always been a man of presence, a ruler whose very stance commanded respect. But now he looked like something else, something that did not belong to this world. Meritneith took a step back. What is happening to you?" The pharaoh's lips parted, but the voice that came out was not his. It was layered, hollow, as if multiple voices spoke through him at once. "I was never truly restored." His lips curled into something that was not a smile. "I was claimed." A chill swept through Neferura's bones. She had brought him back from death, but she had not returned him. Her stomach twisted. She had made a terrible mistake. The following days were filled with tension so thick it suffocated the air. The nobles and generals who had once stood unwaveringly by her side now kept their distance. The priests avoided her gaze entirely. Even the servants scurried through the palace halls like frightened mice. The whispers had grown louder. The people had begun to fear her. Meritneith could sense it the way their eyes lingered on her for just a moment too long. The hushed conversations that ended abruptly whenever she entered a room. But what she did not expect was betrayal. Late one night, as she walked the empty halls of the palace, she felt Ida's shift in the air, a presence that did not belong. The flickering torches cast long, distorted shadows, stretching unnaturally against the stone walls. Then, a sound, the faint shuffle of feet. She turned just as a dagger sliced through the air toward her throat. Instinct took over. Before she could even think, her body moved. Shadows surged around her, twisting, coiling like living things. The blade never reached her skin. It stopped midair, held by an unseen force. The assassin's eyes widened in horror. Then, the shadows lunged. The man let out a strangled scream as the darkness wrapped around him, seeping into his flesh, draining the life from his body before he could even fall to the ground. The torches in the hall sputtered, their light dimming as Meritneith lowered her trembling hand. She looked down at her palm. The sigil of Anubis burned cold. The power was no longer something she controlled. It was something that lived within her. The attack was only the beginning. The court had turned against her, and now the gods themselves would act. The next morning, the sky darkened before the sun had fully risen. A thick mist rolled through the city, curling through the streets like a serpent, pressing against the doors and windows of the temples. Statues of the gods cracked and crumbled, their once divine faces shattering into dust. The people fell to their knees, wailing, crying out for forgiveness. But there was no answer. And then the ground trembled. Meritneith stood at the balcony of the palace, staring down at her city, her heart pounding as the temple spires split apart, their foundations crumbling as if the gods themselves had struck them down. A cold gust of wind howled through the streets, carrying the whispers of voices she could not understand. Then she felt him, a presence older than time itself, a weight pressing against her very soul. Meritneith turned, and there, standing in the shadows of her own throne room, was Anubis. His jackal eyes gleamed in the dim light, amusement flickering in their golden depths. He took one slow step forward, the air around him twisting unnaturally. "Did you think you could escape your fate, Queen of Kemet?" His voice was calm, but beneath it lay something sharp, something final. Meritneith clenched her fists. "I did what had to be done. My people live. My husband lives." Anubis tilted his head slightly. "Your husband is a corpse wearing borrowed flesh. Your people worship a queen who no longer belongs to this world." His gaze darkened. "Your time is up." The temple walls groaned, the very air trembling. The gods had allowed her defiance long enough. But Meritneith would not surrender so easily. She ran. Not out of cowardice, not out of fear, but because she knew if there was even the smallest chance to break this curse, to save herself, she had to try. She fled into the sacred tombs, the oldest part of the city, where the great kings of the past had been laid to rest. Beneath the earth, away from the eyes of gods and men, she searched for something that could undo what had been done. The Book of Thoth, legendary text that held the knowledge of the gods, the one thing that could grant her power equal to the divine. If she could find it, if she could read its words, perhaps she could fight back. But as she reached the deepest chamber of the tomb, her breath came in sharp gasps, her vision blurred. A shadow loomed behind her. A cold hand rested upon her shoulder. And then, a whisper, "You cannot escape me." Meritneith turned slowly, her breath caught in her throat. Anubis stood behind her, his jackal eyes gleaming with cold amusement. The air around him was thick with shadows, swirling and shifting like a living thing. The tomb's stone walls trembled under his presence, the ancient hieroglyphs flickering as if whispering forgotten secrets. "You cannot escape me, Queen of Kemet," he murmured, his voice wrapping around her like the chill of the afterlife. Meritneith swallowed hard, forcing herself to stand tall. "I will not surrender," she said, though her voice wavered. "I have come for the Book of Thoth. I will undo this curse. I will break this fate." Anubis chuckled, a low sound that sent a shiver through her bones. "You still believe you have a choice?" He took a slow step forward, and the very air grew heavier. "There is no undoing what has been done. You called upon me, you made the bargain. And now I have come to collect. Meritneith clenched her fists. I did what I had to do. My people live because of me. My kingdom still stands. And yet, Anubis said softly, tilting his head, you do not. For the first time, Meritneith truly felt it. The weight pressing against her chest, the cold threading through her veins, the whisper of the shadows curling at her feet. She had been changing slowly, gradually, but now, standing before Anubis, the truth was undeniable. She was no longer fully of this world. The god of death extended a hand toward her, his clawed fingers open in invitation. Come willingly, he offered, his voice almost gentle. And I will spare Kemet from the wrath of the gods. Your people will not suffer for your sins. Neferura's breath caught. The choice lay before her, her soul, or her kingdom. Her heart pounded as she stepped back, shaking her head. No, she whispered. Then louder, Number, I will not bow to you. Anubis exhaled sharply, not in anger, but in amusement. So be it. The shadows lurched forward. Meritneith threw her hands out, summoning the power that had become part of her. The darkness at her feet responded, coiling around her, not as an enemy, but as a weapon. The tomb trembled as she struck back. The battle that followed shook the underworld itself. Anubis was faster than anything mortal, faster than anything she had ever faced. He moved like the wind, like a shadow without form, his strikes cutting through the air with terrifying precision. But Meritneith had not made a deal with death without learning its power. She fought like a storm, wielding the very darkness he had given her against him. The tomb walls cracked. Ancient dust filled the air. The whispers of spirits swirled around them, watching, waiting. Meritneith dodged a strike, her heart pounding, her body burning with energy not her own. For a moment, she thought maybe, just maybe, she could win. But then, the shadows betrayed her. Anubis lifted a hand, and the darkness turned against her. The tendrils of shadow that had obeyed her moments ago now wrapped around her wrists, her ankles, her throat. They dragged her to her knees, forcing her to the cold, unyielding stone. She gasped, struggling, but it was useless. The magic was not hers. It had never been hers. It had always belonged to him. Anubis stepped closer, gazing down at her with something that might have been pity. You cannot fight what you have become. Meritneith screamed in frustration, in anger, in defiance. And then, she did the only thing left to do. The sacrifice that saves a kingdom. With her last ounce of strength, Meritneith let go. She stopped struggling, stopped resisting. Instead, she focused. She had made a deal with death. But she was still a queen. And if she could not save herself, she would save her people. Drawing in a final, shuddering breath, she spoke words that had never been uttered before. Not in this world, not in the afterlife. Words whispered to her from the depths of the underworld itself. The shadows froze. The air grew still. Even Anubis hesitated. And then a pulse of power. The sigil on Neferura's palm flared, not with cold, but with light. The magic she had been given, the darkness, the curse, she turned it inward. She pulled it all back into herself. Every tendril, every shadow, every ounce of death that had seeped into her soul. Her body convulsed, her vision blurred. The pain was unimaginable. And then silent. Anubis watched as the shadows slowly unraveled from her, pulling away, dissolving into nothing. Meritneith slumped forward, her breath ragged, her body weak. She had done it. She had taken the curse into herself. Kemet was free. Anubis knelt before her, watching as her life faded. His golden eyes held something unreadable. "You are not like the others," he murmured. "You do not beg. You do not run. You choose." Meritneith barely managed a smile. "A queen always chooses." And with that, she was gone. The sun rose over Kemet the next morning, brighter than it had in years. The black mist that had strangled the land was gone. The statues of the gods, once broken, stood whole once more. The pharaoh, freed from his unnatural existence, crumbled to dust. The people wept, mourning their lost king. But they would never know the true price that had been paid. No one spoke of Meritneith again. Her name was wiped from the records, her image erased from the walls of the temples. It was as if she had never existed. But in the quiet places, in the whispers of the wind, and the flicker of the temple torches, the story remained. The tale of the queen who had made a deal with Death Hand, in the end, had outwitted even the gods. They say on the darkest nights, when the desert wind howls through the tombs, a shadow lingers just beyond the torchlight, watching, waiting. And if you listen closely, you might hear a whisper. A queen always chooses.